He is the only man in the world who killed 47 criminals, while already behind bars. They called him the prison sanitizer. He hunted rapists and traitors, believing he was cleansing the world of filth. But can you call a man a hero if he killed his own father for revenge? Discover the full story of Pedrinho Matador, the killer all of Brazil feared. The story of Brazil's most terrifying beast didn't begin with a baby's first cry, or even with the first drop of blood he spilled, but rather it started in absolute darkness inside the warm womb of a mother, which should have been the safest place in the universe, but instead became his first battlefield back in 1954, in the suffocating, sticky humidity of Minas Gerais, where poverty was etched into people's skin, along with the red dust. In a shack made of rotting wood, a scene played out that was banal for those parts, but fatal for the future of dozens of people. Because Pedro Rodriguez Sr., a man with heavy fists and a soul soaked in cheap alcohol, was once again disciplining his pregnant wife Manuela, simply because he was in a rage, and the reason didn't matter. So in a fit of blind animalistic malice, he kicked her right in the stomach. And it wasn't just a blow to a woman's flesh. It was a strike that traveled through time, smashing into the unborn child and inflicting an injury that permanently damaged his brain. Doctors would later say the baby was born with a dent in his skull, but none of them looked deep enough to see that the kick hadn't just crushed bone, it had damaged the mind. And perhaps in that very second, the lights went out in little Pedro's head, extinguishing pity, compassion, and fear, leaving only a cold, pulsating darkness. He was born, broken, a ticking time bomb, and his childhood was an endless survival school in hell, where he grew up in an atmosphere of total violence where the only language spoken was screaming and beatings, and every bruise on his mother's body was stored in Pedro's memory like a coin in a piggy bank, making him grow up silent and withdrawn with a heavy, unfocused gaze that seemed to look right through people to see their insides. At 13, the mechanism triggered in the womb malfunctioned for the first time while Pedro was working on a sugarcane plantation, enduring hellish labor under the scorching sun next to his cousin near a massive juice press, where metal rollers clanged and hummed, crushing tough stalks into pulp, and in a moment of pure predator's curiosity, he looked at his cousin, then at the rollers, and with frightening calmness, pushed the boy into the working machine. The arm was pulled in, and while another child would have screamed or run for help, Pedro just stood there watching the blood and suffering with the same expression one has, watching running water. And even though the cousin was miraculously saved but left crippled, Pedro felt no guilt, because to him people were just objects. But the real fracture that turned the troubled teen into a monster happened a year later when he was 14. By then the family had moved to Alfenas, but poverty followed them, and his father got a job as a school guard, which gave them a scrap of hope until the day he came home early, pale not from fear, but from rage, because the mayor had fired him, accusing the old man of stealing food from the cafeteria. Pedro's father was a tyrant and a drunk, but not a thief yet. He took his anger out on the easiest target, his wife, beating her while 14-year-old Pedro watched, and suddenly understood a crystal-clear truth that there is no God, no law, and no justice, only power. And if you have a weapon, you make the rules. Something snapped in his brain, and he quietly walked to the backyard. Shed took his grandfather's old rusty shotgun and marched into the street towards City Hall with a clear, logical chain in his damaged mind that the mayor took their food, so the mayor must die. He found the official standing by a car, looking well-fed and arrogant, the embodiment of the power that crushed his family. And before the mayor could even react, Pedro raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger, blasting him in the chest. And while panic erupted around them, Pedro stood absolutely calm, because he wasn't done yet. He knew the real thief was another guard who had framed his father, so he hunted him down through the crowd, smelling their fear like a drug. and found the traitor a few blocks away, delivering a second shot just as cold and precise, making the 14-year-old a double murderer in 15 minutes without blinking an eye. For the first time, the noise in his head went quiet, and he felt a twisted peace, realizing he wasn't made for family or love, but to cleanse the world of filth. Yet he wasn't stupid, and knew he had to run. So he fled to Mogi das Cruzes, into the darkest slums of São Paulo, where laws are written with bullets, and a human life is worth less than a dose of drugs. There, the boy with the dented skull began his rise to become the king of killers working for drug dealers, but his twisted sense of justice remained, and he soon killed his own boss for being too cruel to his men, taking over the racket and becoming one of the most dangerous men in the district before he was even an adult. He killed rivals not just for territory, but because he saw them as dirt that needed to be washed away. Yet even monsters have hearts, and he met Maria Aparecida Olympia, known as Botinha, who became his first and only love, the only one who saw a human inside the beast, and for a moment he had a home. But happiness in the criminal world is a target. Rival gang members, knowing they couldn't beat Pedro in a fair fight, struck his weak point by tracking down Maria and brutally murdering her to send a message. But when Pedro found her body, the last spark of his humanity extinguished forever, and his grief turned into a black rage that made even hardened criminals shudder. He didn't just look for the killer, he declared war on the entire rival clan, storming a wedding where the leader was a guest and unleashing a massacre that went down in history, mowing down the groom, the bride, and the guests, leaving 6 dead and 16 wounded as a sacrifice to Maria's memory. But even this slaughter faded compared to the news that came from his hometown, a blow from the past he tried to outrun, because he learned that his father, the tyrant he had spared at 14, had committed a monstrous crime by killing Pedro's mother in a fit of drunken, jealous madness, hacking her with a machete 21 times. The world ceased to exist for Pedro, leaving only one goal, so he allowed himself to be caught and thrown into the same prison system where his father was awaiting trial, and he spent his time preparing a shiv, a sharpened piece of metal, waiting for the moment which finally came when he entered his father's cell, not as a son, but as the angel of death. He looked at the old man and said only, "You killed my mother," before attacking with mechanical, terrifying precision, stabbing his father 22 times, exactly one more than his father had stabbed his mother, symbolically overpowering his cruelty. But death wasn't enough for the demon controlling Pedro now. When his father stopped breathing, Pedro didn't stop. He knelt before the bloody corpse and performed a ritual that turned him into a legend of nightmares, using his knife to cut into the chest, plunging his hand into the hot, smoking body and ripping out his own father's heart. He held the organ in his hands, staring at it with insane triumph, and according to eyewitness accounts and prison records, he raised the heart to his mouth, committed an act of cannibalism, and then spat it out onto the floor, saying, "I killed my father," and tasted his heart, which was an act of absolute cannibalistic victory, where he absorbed the strength of his enemy and destroyed the one who spawned him, closing a bloody circle of violence that had begun before he was even born. The guards who came running at the noise found a scene that made even experienced jailers' hair stand on end, seeing a young guy with traces of madness on his face standing over a mangled corpse. Yet in his eyes there was not a drop of insanity, only cold steel satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. From that moment, a new life began for Pedro Rodriguez Filho inside the prison walls, where he would spend the next decades. But he did not become a victim of the system, he became its nightmare. Because for a man who killed his father and desecrated the body, there were no longer any moral boundaries, no prohibitions, and no fear. So he became the king of the prison judge and executioner in one person, who would kill again and again, bringing his victim count to incredible numbers. But never in any of his future murders would he put as much personal searing hatred as he put into those 22 knife blows in the São Paulo prison cell. His revenge was accomplished and his mother was avenged. But the price of this vengeance was his own soul, which he spat onto the dirty prison floor, along with a piece of his father's heart, forever remaining in history as Pedrinho Matador, the man who became the most terrifying monster just to defeat the monster that created him. His fame ran ahead of him, and when the guards loaded him into a police van for transport to another maximum security prison, an episode occurred that finally cemented his status as an untouchable monster, because on that day, immediately after the massacre of his father, Pedro was put into a cramped paddy wagon handcuffed to another detainee who was a criminal that had committed crimes against women, and for Pedro, who had his own twisted but iron code of honor in his head, this proximity was offensive since riding handcuffed to trash was worse than death. The trip lasted only a few hours, but when the car stopped and the escorts opened the rear doors, they were met with dead silence because the criminal was dead. Pedro having liquidated him while shackled hand and foot in a cramped space without weapons. And when the shocked police asked what happened, Pedro just shrugged and calmly replied that such filth had no place next to him, and that he was not going to breathe the same air as a criminal, because even a hellhound has its principles. Thus began his path as the janitor of Brazilian prisons, a path that would stretch for 30-odd years and turn him into the most prolific serial killer in the country's history, with the majority of his victims being sent to the next world while he was already behind bars. Since the prison system of Brazil is a branch of hell on earth with overcrowded cells where people sleep in shifts amidst stuffiness, stench disease, and the absolute power of criminal gangs like the Red Command or the First Capital Command. And in this chaos, only those who flock together survive. But Pedro was a lone wolf who didn't need the protection of a gang, because the most dangerous gang in that prison was himself. On his left arm appeared a tattoo that became his calling card, and a warning to all reading, "Mato por prazer," meaning, "I kill for pleasure." And this phrase was not bravado. It was a statement of fact, because for Pedro, murder became the only way to relieve tension, to quiet that hum in his head that had haunted him since birth. Due to his skull injury, and in prison, he continued his mission, considering himself a judge who corrects the errors of the court by killing those who in his opinion did not deserve the right to live even in prison, such as those who committed crimes against children and women, snitches and traitors, who all ended up on his blacklist. He killed 47 prisoners. Think about that number. 47 people, and that is only confirmed data, although Pedro himself claimed there were many more, as he turned murder into a routine part of his daily life. Once 2 new neighbors were placed in his cell, and Pedro immediately warned them not to disturb him, not to snore, and not to bother him. But one of them apparently decided that the old con was just trying to scare him. And at night, this guy started snoring, which for a normal person is a trifle and annoying fact. But for Pedro, whose psyche was taut as a guitar string, it became a trigger. So he got up silently, approached the sleeper, and strangled him. And then to show the second neighbor the seriousness of the situation, he beheaded the body and left a terrible message by twirling a finger at his temple when the guards came for the morning check, simply saying he disturbed my sleep, which was the only explanation he gave. Another case was even more indicative and creepy when his friend, the only person Pedro communicated with in prison, came to visit him once, and Pedro looked at him and said, "I don't like your face today," and killed him simply because he didn't like his face, which was a lesson to everyone that you cannot be friends with Pedro. You cannot trust him because he is a force of nature that can destroy at any moment. Without apparent reason, he does not look for logic. He looks for an outlet for his aggression. To survive in such a mode where every convict dreams of killing you for the fame of saying, "I killed Pedrinho," Pedro turned his body into a weapon, training every day with maniacal persistence, doing 1,000 push-ups, 1,000 squats, and shadowboxing until his muscles became iron and his reaction lightning fast, sleeping lightly like a wild beast, waking up at any rustle and always keeping a shiv at hand, so that even the gods were afraid to enter his cell alone, preferring to do it in a group and with shields. There were cases when Pedro organized riots not to improve conditions, but for the opportunity to get to enemies from other cell blocks, and in one such riot, he killed 5 rivals in 1 hour using a homemade knife and moving through the chaos like a shark in water. Judges added term after term to his sentence first. It was 20 years, then 30, then 100. And in the end, his total sentence exceeded 400 years, which is 4 centuries of prison for one person, a figure that boggles the mind. But in Brazil, there was a law that would eventually play a cruel joke on society, stating that the maximum term of actual imprisonment is limited to 30 years, later raised to 40. But for Pedro, the old law applied, which meant that no matter how many he killed inside, sooner or later, the cage doors had to open. Pedro knew this, and he waited, sitting in solitary confinement, painted with bloody fantasies, counting the days, having become a legend, a scarecrow for children. A monster used to frighten newcomers with inmates whispering, "Don't look him in the eye or he will eat your soul." And there was a grain of truth in that. For 30 years in hell, Pedro did not break. He hardened, becoming the very essence of violence, distilled evil that learned to wait. When the iron gates of the prison swung open in 2007, releasing Pedro into freedom, Brazil held its breath, expecting a new wave of terror. Pedro stepped into a world that had changed beyond recognition. While he sat in solitary, his old phone booths had disappeared. Smartphones had appeared. The internet had entangled the planet in a web, and the favelas where he once started his bloody path had become even more violent and chaotic. But the most amazing thing happened not on the streets, but in the mind of the little killer himself, who suddenly realized that in the 21st century, a weapon is not just a knife or a revolver. It is also information and words. Pedro did not hide, nor did he go underground to slit throats in dark alleys again. Instead, he did something that sounds like the plot of a black comedy. As the most terrible maniac in the history of Brazil, became a popular blogger and YouTube star, creating a channel which he named, without unnecessary modesty, Pedrinho Matador, meaning Pedrinho, the former killer. And hundreds of thousands of people subscribed to him, eager to hear the truth of life from the mouth of a monster. It was a surreal spectacle seeing an elderly man with deep scars not only on his body but also on his soul, sitting in front of a camera in a simple t-shirt, discussing crime, commenting on high-profile cases, giving advice to youth on how not to go to prison, and criticizing modern bandits for their lack of a code of honor. And when the whole country was following the hunt for another maniac, Lázaro Barbosa, Pedro publicly called him an amateur and a coward, stating that if he himself were younger, he would catch Lázaro in a couple of days, because a beast smells a beast. People stopped him on the street not to call the police, but to take a selfie shaking his hand, the very hand that once tore out a heart, and asking for an autograph, while Pedro enjoyed this fame, believing that he had atoned for his sins and that he was reborn, even publishing an autobiography trying to monetize his bloody past. But he forgot one important law that he himself had preached all his life, which is that blood cannot be washed away with likes on the internet, and the past has very long arms. On March 5th, 2023, on a Sunday morning, fate came for him in the very city where it all began in Mogi das Cruzes, where 68-year-old Pedro was sitting on the sidewalk in front of his relative's house, perhaps warming himself in the sun or checking his channel statistics, feeling relaxed and safe because he was now a star, an ex-killer and a pensioner. But karma has no statute of limitations. A black car drove up to the house, an ordinary sedan like thousands of others, and men in masks got out. But it was not a robbery, as they did not demand money or a phone. They came for his life. And Pedro, the man with the reaction of a mongoose who survived prison riots against dozens of enemies this time, did not manage to do anything, as age and relaxation played their role. Shots rang out and bullets hit his old trained body, knocking him off his feet. But this did not seem enough to the shooters. Or perhaps it was a special ritual or message, as one of the attackers approached the lying Pedro, took out a knife, the very weapon that Pedro idolized all his life, and delivered a fatal blow to the neck. It was symbolic cruel and terrifyingly ironic that the man who began his path by cutting people for the sake of his twisted justice ended his life on dirty asphalt with a fatal wound, becoming the victim of just such a faceless reprisal. The killers got into the car and disappeared, leaving the lifeless body of the king of killers in front of passers-by, who immediately took out their phones, but no longer for a selfie, but to film his corpse, while the police began an investigation with versions ranging from revenge by the First Capital Command drug cartel, which Pedro criticized in his videos, to a vendetta by relatives of one of his many victims. But the essence remained the same, which is that the circle had closed. The story of Pedro Rodriguez Filho is not a story about repentance. It is a story about how violence begets only violence, and this perpetual motion machine of death cannot be stopped. It can only be temporarily silenced for the man who killed his father to avenge his mother, and who killed rapists and thieves, considering himself the janitor of the forest, was eventually disposed of, like garbage, when his time passed, while his YouTube channel remained a digital monument to human madness, where in the comments, people still argue whether he was a hero, cleansing the world of filth, or the most terrible demon the land of Brazil ever birthed. But Pedro took the answer to this question with him, to the grave, leaving us only a grim biography and a final silent lesson, that he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, even if at the end of his life he exchanged the sword for a blogger's microphone. He spent his entire life killing monsters only to eventually become the ultimate prey himself, because Pedro believed that a smartphone camera would protect him better than a knife. But he was wrong, since in real life, unlike on YouTube, you cannot delete a bad take, and so the circle is closed as darkness finally took its son home.